At some point in the life of every genuinely intelligent person, something shifts. It is not dramatic. It does not happen in a single moment of disillusionment or defeat. It happens gradually, the way a tide pulls back from a shore, slowly at first, then with increasing certainty, until one day the person looks around and realizes they have moved further from the world than most people around them will ever understand.
Wow.
They have withdrawn, not in defeat, not in bitterness, not because life broke them, because something inside them, something clear and deliberate and deeply intelligent, decided that the world as most people inhabit it was no longer worth the cost of full participation. Carl Jung called this process the confrontation with the collective. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing 5 centuries earlier from a very different vantage point, described it as the natural consequence of seeing too clearly in a world that rewards comfortable blindness. Both men arrived at the same observation through entirely different methods, Jung through the interior landscape of the human psyche, Machiavelli through the brutal exterior landscape of political reality. And what they both found was this: the person who thinks deeply enough, who sees clearly enough, refuses consistently enough to pretend that the surface of things is the whole of things, will eventually find themselves standing at a distance from the crowd that they did not entirely choose and cannot entirely close. This video is about that distance, what creates it, what it means, and why, understood correctly, it is not a sign of failure or dysfunction or social inadequacy. It is one of the most psychologically coherent responses an intelligent person can have to a world that was not designed with them in mind. Jung spent decades studying what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of the human species, the patterns and archetypes and assumptions that most people absorb from their culture without ever examining. He observed that the majority of people live almost entirely within this collective framework. Their values are borrowed, their beliefs are inherited. Their sense of what constitutes a good life is assembled from the expectations of the group they belong to, the family they came from, the culture that shaped them before they were old enough to choose. This is not a criticism. It is simply a description of how most human psychological development proceeds. But occasionally, and Jung believed this was genuinely rare, a person begins the process of individuation. They begin to pull their identity free from the collective mold. They start asking questions that the collective has no comfortable answers for. They find themselves unable to accept consensus reality simply because everyone around them accepts it. They notice the gap between what people say and what they do, between the values society claims to hold and the values it actually rewards, between the stories culture tells about itself and the reality those stories are designed to conceal. And once they start noticing this gap, they cannot stop. The noticing becomes involuntary. The distance begins to grow. Machiavelli understood this from the other direction. He was not a psychologist. He was a diplomat, a strategist, a man who had spent years at the center of political power in Renaissance Florence before being stripped of everything and exiled to his farm outside the city. It was in that exile, in that enforced withdrawal from the world he had served, that he wrote The Prince. And what he wrote was not a manual for cruelty, as it is so often misread. It was an act of radical honesty, a refusal to describe the world as it should be in favor of describing the world as it actually was. He wrote that the man who ignores what is done in favor of what ought to be done learns his destruction rather than his preservation. In other words, the person who insists on seeing reality clearly, rather than through the flattering lens of how things are supposed to work, pays a price for that clarity. The price is often distance from institutions, from social circles, from the comfortable fictions that bind most people together. The first reason smart people withdraw from society is that intelligent conversation becomes genuinely rare. This is not arrogance. It is arithmetic. The person who thinks at depth, who has spent years examining their own psychology, reading widely, sitting with difficult questions, and refusing to accept easy answers, inevitably finds that most social interaction operates at a level that does not engage the parts of them that feel most alive. Small talk is not merely boring to the deeply intelligent person. It is exhausting in a specific way, the way that any sustained performance of being less than you are is exhausting. You can do it. You can smile and nod and participate in conversations about surface-level things. But every hour spent doing so is an hour not spent in the kind of exchange that actually nourishes you. And over time, the math of that exchange starts to feel like a losing proposition. Jung called this the problem of the differentiated individual in an undifferentiated collective. The person who has done significant psychological work, who has confronted their shadow, integrated their contradictions, developed genuine self-knowledge, exists at a different register of awareness than the person who has not. And different registers of awareness produce different registers of conversation. The differentiated individual is not better than the undifferentiated one. They are simply operating on a frequency that most social environments are not tuned to receive. Withdrawal that follows is not rejection. It is the natural consequence of a signal finding no receiver. The second reason smart people withdraw is that they develop an intolerance for the performance of values that are not actually held. Every social group maintains a set of stated values, things the group claims to believe in, to stand for, to organize itself around: loyalty, honesty, fairness, merit, the intelligent person, over enough time, notices the gap between these stated values and the actual behaviors the group rewards. They watch people who embody the stated values be passed over in favor of people who are merely better at performing them. They watch honesty punished and strategic dishonesty rewarded. They watch the language of fairness used to justify outcomes that are anything but fair. And at some point, the performance of believing in the stated values of pretending not to notice the gap becomes psychologically untenable. Machiavelli would have recognized this instantly. He spent his career inside institutions that claimed to operate on principles of justice, loyalty, and civic virtue, and watched those same institutions destroy men of genuine integrity while elevating men of polished cynicism. His withdrawal was forced, but his writings suggest he had already completed the interior withdrawal long before the exterior one was imposed on him. He had already stopped believing the performance. He had already made the internal adjustment that the genuinely intelligent person always eventually makes the shift from hoping that the world will live up to its stated values to simply seeing the world as it is and deciding what to do with that knowledge. The third reason smart people withdraw from society is that solitude becomes not just tolerable, but genuinely productive in a way that most social environments simply are not. Jung was explicit about this. He believed that the deepest psychological work, the confrontation with the shadow, the integration of the unconscious, the development of genuine self-knowledge, could only happen in solitude. Not because other people are not useful to the process, but because the noise of constant social engagement makes the interior voice impossible to hear. The person who is always surrounded by others, always processing the input of the social world, always calibrating their behavior to the expectations of those around them, never develops the relationship with their own depths that genuine intelligence requires. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of intelligent withdrawal. The person who withdraws is not running away from the world. They are running toward something, toward a quality of interior life that is simply not available in the midst of constant social noise. They are choosing the conversation with their own psyche over the conversation with a world that is mostly talking about things that do not matter to them. And the work they do in that solitude, the thinking, the writing, the reflection, the slow and difficult process of becoming more fully themselves is real work. It produces real results. It makes them more capable, more clear, more genuinely useful to the world when they choose to re-engage with it. The fourth reason is one that Machiavelli would identify immediately. The intelligent person withdraws. Because full social participation requires a degree of strategic self-deception that the deeply honest mind cannot sustain. Every social group requires its members to perform a version of themselves that is compatible with the group's norms, values, and self-image. This performance is not usually conscious. Most people slip into their social persona as naturally as they slip into their clothes in the morning. But for the person who has done enough psychological work to be genuinely aware of the gap between their true self and their social self, the performance becomes visible. And a performance you can see yourself giving is exhausting in a way that an unconscious one never is. The intelligent person withdraws partly because they can no longer perform the self-deception required for comfortable social immersion. Their awareness has made them too honest for the level of pretense that ordinary social life demands. The fifth reason is perhaps the most important and the least discussed. Smart people withdraw because they have learned, through enough painful experience, that genuine depth is not welcomed by the majority of social environments, it is managed. The person who thinks too clearly, questions too persistently, sees too accurately, and refuses to soften their perception to fit the comfort level of the group is not celebrated by most social structures. They are tolerated at best and subtly excluded at worst. Not through overt hostility, through the thousand small signals that every social group uses to communicate who belongs and who is merely being accommodated. The slightly too long pause before responding to their comment, the way conversations shift when they enter a room, the sense that their presence creates a low-level discomfort in people who are not sure what to do with someone who refuses to pretend. Jung called this the price of differentiation. Machiavelli called it the inevitable consequence of seeing the world without the flattering distortions that make group life comfortable. Both would agree on the result. The person who pays this price consistently enough eventually stops offering their depth to environments that cannot receive it, not in anger, in conservation. They learn to hold their real perceptions privately, to share them only in spaces where they will be met rather than managed, and to build their life around the quality of their own interior experience rather than around the validation of the social world. What does this withdrawal actually look like in practice? It looks like a person who has a small number of deep relationships rather than a large number of shallow ones. It looks like someone who is selective about their environments, who chooses carefully where they spend their energy and declines without guilt the invitations that would require them to perform a version of themselves they no longer believe in. It looks like someone who has built a rich interior life through reading, through reflection, through creative work, through the sustained cultivation of their own thinking that does not depend on external validation for its nourishment. It looks from the outside like aloofness or introversion or social anxiety. From the inside, it is none of those things. It is clarity. It is the decision, made consciously or unconsciously over years, to stop spending the currency of genuine intelligence in markets that do not know its value. Jung and Machiavelli, writing centuries apart, arrived at the same counsel for the person who finds themselves in this position. Jung said, "Go inward. Do the work of knowing yourself so completely that you no longer need the world's confirmation to feel real. Build the relationship with your own depths that no social environment can give you and no social rejection can take away." Machiavelli said, "See clearly, protect yourself intelligently, and stop expecting the world to reward you for virtues it does not actually value." Both pieces of counsel are correct. Both are necessary, and together they form something that looks less like a withdrawal from life and more like a graduation into a more demanding and more honest version of it. The smart person who withdraws from society is not giving up. They are recalibrating. They are redistributing their energy away from environments that consume it, without return, and toward the interior and exterior spaces where it actually compounds. They are choosing depth over breadth, quality over quantity, genuine solitude over the loneliness of being surrounded by people who cannot see them. They are doing, in their own way, exactly what Jung and Machiavelli both pointed toward, building a self that is strong enough, clear enough, and honest enough to stand without the scaffolding of constant social approval. And that self, built in the quiet, forged in the distance, shaped by the willingness to see things as they are, rather than as they are supposed to be, is the rarest and most powerful thing a human being can become. Not because it makes them superior to others, but because it makes them finally, completely, irreducibly themselves. In a world of performances, the person who has stopped performing is the most dangerous and the most free.